how does a king's desperate need for a son end up creating a brand new national church and, well, completely changing the course of history? So today we're going to unpack the incredible story of Henry VIII and the creation of the Church of England. You know, the biggest irony in this whole story is that the man who broke English Catholicism was at first one of its greatest champions. He even earned this title you see here, Fidei Defensor, that's Defender of the Faith, which was given to him by the Pope himself for viciously attacking the Protestant reformer Martin Luther in writing. So, what on earth went wrong? I mean, how do you go from being the Pope's favorite guy to becoming his #1 enemy in just a few short years? Well, the answer wasn't some sudden crisis of faith or a big change in theology. No, it was all about politics, power, and one all-consuming royal obsession. And that obsession, it was all about securing a male heir. For Henry, this was everything. I mean, England had just barely recovered from decades of a bloody civil war called the Wars of the Roses, and he was absolutely convinced that without a son to take the throne, the country would just collapse right back into chaos. The stability of the entire nation was on the line. And this all spiraled into a full-blown crisis. On one side, you've got his wife, Catherine of Aragon. She's devout, she's loyal, but she's past childbearing age and has only one surviving child, a daughter. And on the other side, you've got Henry, who's becoming obsessed with the idea that their marriage is cursed by God, which is why he can't have a son. And, oh yeah, just to make things even messier, he's fallen head over heels for the charismatic Anne Boleyn. This whole mess, this perfect storm of a succession crisis, a crisis of conscience, and a new love affair, it became known to history as the Great Matter. Now, Henry's first move wasn't to just tear everything down. He actually tried to play by the rules. He went to the Pope and asked for an annulment, which is basically a declaration that the marriage was never valid to begin with. This would free him up to marry Anne and hopefully have a legitimate male heir. So you might be thinking, that seems pretty straightforward, right? I mean, popes had granted annulments to kings before, so why didn't Pope Clement VII just give Henry what he wanted and save everyone the drama? Well, the problem was a complete geopolitical gridlock. See, the Pope, the guy who had to make the decision, was effectively a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And who was Charles V? Oh, just Catherine of Aragon's incredibly powerful nephew. There was absolutely no way the Pope could humiliate the emperor's aunt without facing massive consequences. He was completely trapped. So, with the traditional path totally blocked, Henry, with a big push from advisors like Thomas Cromwell, decided on a truly radical new strategy. If you can't get permission from the guy in charge, well then you just remove the guy from charge. And look, this didn't happen overnight. It was a very calculated, systematic dismantling of papal power in England. Starting in 1529, Henry used what's called the Reformation Parliament to pass a whole series of laws, piece by piece, that just chipped away at the Pope's authority until the final decisive break. And here it is, the climax, the 1534 Act of Supremacy. This single sentence completely upended 1,000 years of history. It declared that the King of England, not the Pope in Rome, was the head of the church in England. Boom. Just like that, religion was nationalized. And let's be clear, this was not optional. You had to swear an oath, acknowledging Henry's new title. If you refused, that was an act of treason, and the punishment was death. And this was no empty threat. Some of the most high-profile figures in England, like Henry's own former chancellor, Sir Thomas More, were executed because they stayed loyal to Rome. So being the head of the church wasn't just about spiritual authority. Oh no, it also gave Henry control over its vast, vast wealth. And what followed was one of the largest transfers of property in English history, what was, for all intents and purposes, a hostile takeover. I mean, just try to wrap your head around this. Back in the 1530s, the Catholic Church owned roughly a quarter of all the land in England. Think about that. 1 out of every 4 acres in the entire country. That's an unbelievable amount of wealth and power, and now it was all under Henry's control. And he wasted absolutely no time seizing it. Between 1536 and 1541, every single monastery and nunnery was shut down. All their assets were confiscated. But then came the politically brilliant move. Henry sold off all that land to the rising gentry and noble classes. And why was that so clever? because it ensured that England's most influential people now had a direct financial stake in making sure the country stayed separate from Rome. The result was just staggering. Henry became the richest monarch in English history, practically overnight. And he plowed that money into funding his wars and, maybe most importantly, building a massive navy that would lay the foundations for Britain's future as a global power. So, after all that, Henry got his annulment, he married Anne Boleyn, and eventually, he even got his male heir. But what about the new church that was born from his personal crisis? What was its long-term legacy? Okay, so here's something you've really got to understand. Henry himself was no Protestant. In fact, he couldn't stand Martin Luther's theology. For him, his new church was, in practice, just Catholicism, but with him in charge instead of the Pope. The Mass was still in Latin, priests were still celibate, most of the rituals stayed exactly the same. The church that we recognize today, that really took shape under his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. She was a political genius, and she masterfully created a compromise, a via media or a middle way, that was designed to keep the nation from tearing itself apart. So it was Catholic in its style and its structure, but it was Protestant in its core theology, a truly unique hybrid. And you can draw a straight line from then to now. The monarch's role as the head of the church is an unbroken chain. It stretches all the way from Henry's power grab in 1534 through Elizabeth's slightly different title, right up to today with King Charles III as the supreme governor. Which brings us to our final thought. Look, Henry VIII didn't set out to create a new religion. He just really wanted a new wife. But in the process, he established this huge principle, that a nation's laws could stand above the decrees of the Pope. So what should we take away from this? Was the creation of the Church of England a bold triumph of national sovereignty? Or was it, in the end, just the world's most expensive divorce settlement?